Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Mordy and Glory video. Recently, I ran a 300,000 point game of Warhammer 40k. It was apocalypse, it was epic, it was truly the biggest game I have ever played. We had people traveling from all over the world to take part, and what I want to do today with this episode is tell you all about it. I will be covering the epic highs and the terrible lows and everything in between. I'll tell you about some of the lore, narrative and planning that went into the event, and of course take you through step by step how the battle developed over the course of the weekend and who managed to win the event. Of course, as I am recanting all of these tales, I will make sure there are loads of epic pictures and video clips up on the screen for your viewing pleasure. But you know what? That's enough of an introduction. I am just absolutely bursting with excitement. I can't wait to tell you guys all about this. So let's just dive right into today's episode. So the very first thing that I want to do before we go any further is say thank you. Thank you to everyone that came to the event. When I first organized it, I thought I would be lucky if I had 20 people turn up. I figured maybe we'd get a dozen and I'd have to just put a big table together and we'd have a big game of 40k and it'd be a bit of fun and that would be it. In the end, we had over 40 people attend to the event. It was epic. It was so good and every single person that came had exactly the right attitude. All smiles, all positivity, all awesome. We had no issues. Nobody got on each other's nerves. It was just amazing. And so I want to say a massive thank you to everyone that came because you did make it an awesome, awesome event. I also want to do a special shout out to two people in particular, Lord Prayer and Deaf Noise Marine. These are the two team captains, and without them, I don't think the event would have been half as good. Not only did they rally their teams, get them in the right mindset, get them role-playing, narrative playing, but they also served as my wise counsel before the event and during it. Honestly, I relied on these guys so much. They were an amazing help, and I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. And finally, I want to say a thank you to the venue, Element Games, for hosting us. They were amazing. They went above and beyond and they really looked after us. They always made sure that our lunch was sorted. They made sure there was plenty of staff on so that we always had someone we needed to talk to about anything. And of course, most importantly, they made sure that the bar was fully stocked and the drinks kept on a-flowing. But with all of that said, now let's move on and let's start off by taking a look at the background to the event. What was this thing all about? In real world terms, this is something that I've been looking forward to and planning for ages. Probably for the last 20 years, I've had this idea in my head ever since I was a little kid. Because I've seen loads of different apocalypse games over the years, but there was always something about them that didn't quite feel right. Often they just felt like a big game of 40k, but they didn't really encapsulate what it would be like to fight on a true 40k scale battle with thousands of infantry involved, hundreds of tanks. And one of the big parts of that I always felt with Apocalypse was that people still played them on like 6x4 boards. Even if it was one very long 6x4 board, both armies would start like 24 inches apart from each other, and deployment zones would be so crammed and so cramped that you couldn't ever really move anything. And whilst it looked good on picture, when you started actually playing it, it became very obvious that models just weren't really being able to move around or anything like that. And another thing that always used to frustrate me about seeing other Apocalypse games or playing in other Apocalypse games was that the missions always just seemed to boil down to just killing each other. It's a big battle, we're going to throw loads of dice and we're going to kill each other. And I wanted something that was a little bit more than that. You see, what I wanted to create was, for lack of a better term, a 40k mil-sim event. To try and actually make something that feels like, and I don't like using this word in 40k, but a realistic battle. where there are actual battle lines, where there is a back and forth, where breakthroughs are achievable, where outflanking is a big deal, where being able to actually hold a line means something, and giving players a sense of the difficulty and frustration of assaulting a well-defended position. I very much wanted this to feel like a battle and not just like a game. The first step in achieving this was to get the players invested, get them on board. And so ahead of the event, as we were getting closer and closer, I ended up releasing more information. So at first I gave them the background of the planet, and then I started revealing the different maps that they were going to be playing on, giving little hints as to what they could expect to encounter on there. And what this allowed the teams to do was start getting hyped up, start getting in the right mind frame, and they could start planning what they were going to do on the day. So rather than just turning up and memeing it, they would instead come through the day with a battle plan. They knew who was going to be on which table. They knew the disposition of their forces. And again, a big shout out to Lord Prayer and Def Noisman here. They were amazing at cultivating this plotting and this scheming and this planning. For me, I knew this part of the event had been successful when I found out that the Imperial team had busted out the online interactive whiteboard, and they had a detailed battle plan for each mission and how they were going to achieve it. But speaking of missions, there were no primary points or secondary points, no tactical or fixed objectives or anything like that. This is not a normal game of Warhammer 40k. Instead, the weekend would consist of 4 huge apocalypse boards. Each one of these would represent a different area on the planet of Thanatos, which is the world that both teams were fighting for control over. We had Jungle Board, we had the Manufactorum, we had the Hive City, and we had the Polar Fortress. Each one of these maps would have their own unique bespoke mission, and each one would also have their own unique biome and feel. I'll take you through each one of those missions and how each battle grid developed over the course of 2 days, but to give you an example, the Chaos team was assaulting the Imperial Hive, and all I told the Chaos team to do was to capture the Governor's Palace, which was at the far end of the table. How they did that was entirely up to them. I gave them the skeleton, I gave them the overall mission, and then it was up to them to execute a battle plan and to come up with a way of achieving it. If you've ever played anything like D&D, it's kind of similar to that. You give the players the overall goal of what you want them to achieve, but really it's up to them on what journey and what path they choose to take. And all you do is kind of manage them along the way and nudge them in the right direction. But you know what? I think that's enough background information for now. I know why you guys are really here. You want to see the awesome pictures and videos and hear the epic tales of what happened over the weekend. So without further ado, let's dive into our first battle grid of the weekend, and that was the Jungle Board. So the Jungle Boards were there to represent the vast forests that cover almost the entire surface of Thanatos. If you're interested in knowing a little bit more about the planet and the background to the event and the lore, I'll make sure there's a link down in the description. But in brief, essentially there is a unique biosphere on Thanatos that allows plant life to grow ridiculously quickly. On other worlds where it might take 5 or 10 years for a tree to reach full maturity, on Thanatos it takes a matter of days. Fighting over this biome, we had 3 players from each team. There were the Tyranids, there were the Chaos Demons and the Traitor Guard on the Chaos side, and there were the 3 Imperial Guard players on the Imperium team. The size of the board was roughly 8 foot by 18 foot, and both teams were deploying in a Dawn of War style, so they had the long edge to deploy on. As you can probably guess, this map was dominated by loads and loads of forest, with isolated settlements and locations dotted around the map. In terms of the key locations though, the areas that the players would be fighting over and whoever controlled the most would determine who won that map for their team, there were 5 primary objectives. There was the Research Base Alpha, Research Base Bravo, the Old Fort, Sloppy Bottom Village, and bang in the center of the map, there was the Cathedral of Kadesh. This was a very ceremonial name for what was essentially a large ancient landing pad that marked the area where colonists had first arrived on the planet. Interestingly, both sides employed quite different tactics when it came to approaching this map. The Imperium team spread their forces out equally across the board. Lines upon lines of infantry backed up by 3 or 4 super heavy tanks and a few Leman Russes as well. I would definitely say the bulk of the Imperial infantry was deployed on the jungle board. Shout out to Tanith Will, who turned up with 550 fully painted Imperial Guard infantry models, all of which were lovingly converted to represent the Tanith first and only. The Chaos team very much deployed in their own armies. We had the Tyranids that dominated the left and center, the demons which were kind of in the center, but obviously being demons they were popping up all over the place, and then the Traitor Guard forces that were anchoring the right flank. At first, it seemed as if both sides were equally matched. The Imperium advanced upon all fronts. It was the winter contingency, and they were pushing forward, trying to put pressure on all parts of the heretic line. However, the traitor forces were cunning. You see, they deployed a token force on each flank, and they continued to push spare forces onto those areas, but they concentrated the bulk of their demonic and Tyranid Titanic units into the center, creating a spearhead. This thrust was led by the legendary Great Unclean One, Mr. Blobby, and he just would not die. Shadow swords, Bane blades, Lasgun bolt, even the bayonet struggled to dislodge him from his slow yet inexorable advance. And thanks to the efforts of Mr. Blobby, the heretical team took the central landing pad. And they held it, even against a spirited Imperial counterpush of over 100 Tanith infantry. In fact, for 2 turns, the Imperium tried to dislodge the demonic and tyrannic forces holding the Cathedral of Kadesh. But unfortunately, they just weren't quite able to do it. Mr. Blobby surviving on a single wound after surviving 4 turns of combat, 2 battle rounds. As a result of their sterling work, gripping on by their fingernails, the traitor team was awarded with a narrative event. These narrative events were wildcards, and essentially they acted as pivotal turning points, and they were rewards for players that had done something notable. They managed to achieve something important on their particular battle grid. Now, there were a few of these on each table, and I didn't tell the players what they were going to be until they actually unlocked them. I would hint and I would say, maybe you should investigate that research base, maybe you should have a look at what that ruin is in the forest. And up until this point, both teams had made a cursory effort to have a look into the various key locations on the map. So I think both teams had looked into the research bases. The Imperium team had found that Research Base Alpha was a giant satellite dish that could link up to communication satellites in orbit and give them much better targeting data. This allowed them to finally shoot through the forest. Up until this point, I'd said, unless you're in the forest, you can't shoot through it. And the Heretic team had investigated Research Base Bravo, which was a cartographer, and the scientists there had spent decades and decades mapping out the extensive forest of Thanatos, and this meant they could actually move through the forest at no penalty. Up until this point, I had said you could only move through at half speed. But the Cathedral of Kadesh was the big deal. It was the main objective. It was the hot tamale. It was why both sides had come to this battle grid and what they were fighting over. And so it needed a big wildcard. It needed to be very important. And as a result of the Chaos team not only taking it, but also holding it against a very determined Imperial counterattack, they were rewarded with two things. Globally, it meant that the Chaos team had air superiority. This meant that the Chaos Captain could respawn D3 flyers on any of the 4 battle grids each turn, giving them a constant stream of air support. But locally, it was even more impactful. I allowed Tyranid player, who had lost the most up until this point, to bring back about 70% of the casualties that had been suffered. Carnifexes, Titans, Gants, anything and everything that you could fit onto the landing pad and 6 inches around it, you were allowed to bring back. This was a huge swing in the favor of the Chaos team on Jungle Map. It massively gave them the balance of power and essentially meant that the Imperium was really on the back foot. Unless Lord Prayer, the Imperial captain, decided to put reinforcements into the area, it did not look like the Imperial Guard was going to hold the now endless swarms of Tyranids. And that is how Jungle Map looked at the end of day 1, with a huge Tyranid reinforcement and the Imperial Guard being forced onto the defensive. In between day 1 and day 2, there was some furious debate inside Imperial High Command. Would they try and reinforce the jungle board and salvage the situation, or were they going to leave it to its fate? After many beers were drunk and much curry was eaten, Imperial High Command took the difficult yet necessary decision to not reinforce Jungle Board. Imperial forces would have to hold the line and die for the Emperor. Their job now merely to tie down the Tyranids, the Demons and the Traitor Guard and make sure that they weren't reassigned to other sectors, because at the end of day 1 it was looking a bit dicey for the Imperium. In fact, so much so that no matter how bad the Jungle Board situation seemed, Lord Prayer took the executive decision as team captain to reassign one of the players from Jungle Board to Hive Primus, where the Imperial defense was under incredible pressure. And it just so happened that the player that was being reassigned was the Cadian 42nd Armoured, and if the name doesn't give you a hint, it was the player that had the most tanks on that board. And so day 2 rolls around for Jungle Map, and not only are the Tyranids massively reinforced, but they've also just lost their principal fire support. It was going to come down to the infantryman and his rifle. But as is so often the case in Warhammer 40k, then it got worse. Lord General Halfenstream had been given command of the jungle sector, with his second as Tanith Will. And just as they managed to stabilise the front, managed to get the situation somewhat under control, stop losing ground, the heavens descended upon them. Mycetic spore after mycetic spore crashed into the surface of Jungle Board, and emerging from the blubberous fleshy masses was wave after wave of termagants, rippers and tervigons. You see, elsewhere on the planet, the Chaos Forces had managed to achieve orbital dominance, allowing their transport ships to come in closer and disgorge unholy amounts of reinforcements down onto the planet. This meant that Jungle Board went from a Herculean task to a downright impossible one. And the Imperial commanders knew all they could do is hold the line for as long as possible. The flanks collapsed first. Sloppy Bottom was lost later on, but not before every man, woman and child was conscripted into the Imperial defenders, giving them a much needed manpower boost. But it was merely meat to throw into the grinder. And just as all hope looked lost, final Imperial defenders were huddled around the defenses of Research Base Alpha. It had become their Alamo. But just as all hope seemed lost, reinforcements finally arrived. A Warhound Titan, part of Legio Thanatos, had answered the call. They came to uphold their ancient oath to always protect the Cathedral of Kadesh, to never let it fall into the Chaos hands, even if trying to do so would mean certain doom. Unfortunately for the Imperial defenders, one Warhound Titan, although mighty, was not going to be enough to turn the tide. It merely bought the survivors time long enough to withdraw in a fairly ordered manner. The jungle was lost, but at least the defenders had done what they needed to do. The Chaos forces had been completely tied down in this area, and this meant that the Imperium was able to successfully go on the attack elsewhere. So, in summary, the Jungle Board was a huge and total major victory for the heretic side. The Imperium had almost been completely driven out, and without the Warhound Titan, their forces would have been destroyed to a man. But now, let us move on to another battle grid. It's time to take a look at what was going on in the Polar Fortress. Far to the north, the Imperium and the Chaos forces were fighting over the region known as the Polar Fortress. It was known as this because of the large fortification that dominated the area, an ancient orbital laser. In years gone by, this fortress had formed part of the first line of defense on Thanatos against spaceborne invaders. But as the world became more populous and eventually grew up to be a manufactorum and a hive world, ground-based defenses essentially became obsolete. And instead, the planet was ringed by defense satellites and stations. But with the orbital war being so hotly contested now, with neither side being able to get an advantage, installations such as the Polar Fortress suddenly became vitally important once again. Even a single defense laser such as this could tip the balance in the Void War. And clearly both sides recognized this, because such was the importance put on the Polar Fortress that between both sides, not one, not two, but 4 Titans were fielded, by far the majority of the Titans available to both teams. There were 2 Warhounds on the Chaos side, and a Warhound and a Mighty Reaver on the Imperial side. Of course, these weren't the only forces battling it out over this battle grid. The Imperium had a significant contingent of Imperial armor dedicated here as well. In total, there were about 4 to 5 players on the Imperium team with a huge amount of armor, several super heavies, and of course, innumerable Leman Russes and Rogel Dawns. The Chaos side was much more of an eclectic mix. Naturally, there were several Traitor Guard players there with a assortment of super heavies, Leman Russes, and infantry and artillery, but there was also a small contingent of Dark Elder. Who knows how they had been bribed over to the Chaos side, but there they were. And last but definitely not least, a huge array of Traitor Knights. War machine after war machine, and we're not just talking armigers either. We even had mighty Castellans striding forth, although they were somewhat dwarfed by the Titans that marched alongside them. Just a quick amusing side note here, whilst most other boards, especially the jungle one, were quickly descending into madness and mayhem with players on both sides playing an incredibly intense game of 40k, Polar board was a sea of calm and collectiveness. Both sides were really chill, really friendly, and it quickly got nicknamed the Gentleman's Game. But speaking of the game, day one was pretty straightforward for both sides. They were essentially moving from their staging areas towards the central fortress. Of course, there were many shots exchanged and much firefights were happening, but Operation Mosh Pit had not yet gone ahead, and it was very much a long-range artillery game and Volcano Lance duel. There were a few notable moments from that first day. To start off, the Imperial team made it to the fortress first, and thanks to the command codes of a senior officer and the tech know-how of a regimental engineer, they were able to get the orbital cannon up and running and achieve orbital dominance. What this meant is elsewhere, including on their table, but across the whole gaming hall, the Imperial team could now deep strike in 2 inches closer. So if you deep strike in 9 inches away, it meant you could come in 7. And if you could deep strike in closer than that, you could get really, really close. This was very, very good for the Imperial team because, of course, they had lots of drop pods. They had Astartes on their team. And so being able to get those drop pods in even closer was very important. Unfortunately for the Imperium, it didn't go all their way. The Chaos side used one of their super stratagems. Now, this was a unique mechanic I developed for the game. Each captain was given 4 stratagem cards at the beginning of the event. These were the Rapid Reaction Force, which would allow them to respawn a player in and they could deep strike in anywhere on any table. And then they also had the Shock and Awe super stratagem, which was essentially the equivalent of like a huge basilisk bombardment that covered a 24-inch diameter. There was also the Blitzkrieg super stratagem, which doubled all of the movement for your team on one board for 1 turn. And lastly, but definitely not least, there was the Orbital Land Strike. This was essentially an orbital bombardment that you could call in and nuke one enemy target. It generated the equivalent of 3 maxed out Shadow Sword attacks. So that is 12 Shadow Sword shots. These could be split into 3-4 shot chunks, or they could be used in one big barrage. And the Chaos team decided that the Reaver Titan was causing them too much of a headache, and they hit it with a max blast strength attack from the orbital lance. And in total, I think they were able to do something like 36 or 48 damage to the Reaver, just collapsing it, bringing it down in one fell swoop. To make matters worse, despite the fact the Imperium had initially turned the orbital laser on, they weren't able to keep control of it, and the Chaos team pushed them back. By the end of day 1 in the Polar Fortress, both sides were pushing in to the main fortification, and they'd established forward operating bases. The Imperium team had one in the village of Frosthaven, and the Chaos one had a forward operating base in the Shrine of Saint Katarina. At the end of day 1, beginning of day 2, both sides were kind of looking for an advantage, and they decided to investigate their respective forward bases. The Imperium discovered that they were able to conscript the local citizens of Frosthaven, much like they had done in Sloppy Bottom, and what this allowed them to do was to essentially, once per game on the polar board, any squad that was below strength could be instantly brought back up to 4 strength. Even if there's 1 man left in it, you could bring 19 guys back. That's absolutely fine. So they could essentially push a lasgun into everyone's hands and march them to the front. Very Imperium. The Chaos team discovered that the shrine to Saint Katarina actually was a secret Chaos shrine, and secretly this had been one of the reasons why the Imperium had abandoned the Polar Fortress, because soldiers stationed there kept having horrific nightmares and going mad and killing their fellow troopers. Naturally, being the Chaos team and discovering a Chaos shrine, they were very excited, and they decided that the best course of action was to conduct a human sacrifice. Of course! Sacrifice souls to the Chaos gods. This actually worked. Their initial offering was a squad of guardsmen to Nurgle, but this barely even got his attention. In a battle of this scale, 10 minor souls weren't really much to write home about. Therefore, the Chaos team decided to up the ante. Rather than increasing it bit by bit to see what would get Nurgle's attention, they decided to go all in. 120 guardsmen, 4 command squads, several senior officers, and a Lord Solar later, and they had Nurgle's attention. The shrine started glowing and pulsating. A green energy started to infuse the soldiers in their army, and the Chaos team was given a minor blessing. They got an extra super stratagem, much like the Imperium team. They could only use it in the Polar Fortress, and for one turn, they could increase the toughness of their army by +1. But I hinted to the Chaos players that there was more than one tier of worship, and you could do sacrifices to other gods as well. I'm not gonna lie, I think the Chaos team got a little bit distracted by the shrine mechanic, but in the best possible way. They decided that they were not interested in the mere trinket that was an orbital defense laser. They wanted to keep on sacrificing stuff to their gods. It's a narrative event at the end of the day. It's pretty much what the Chaos side probably would have done. So by the end of day 2, the Chaos team had sacrificed easily 10,000 points of stuff on the shrine. Shadow swords, Rogel Dawns, knights, field ordnance batteries, anything and everything they could get their hands on, they funneled it into the shrine while still making a good effort on the center Polar Fortress. But it would be remiss of me to deny the fact that I think an extra 10,000 points might have made the difference in the center. But their hard work did pay off. Although by the end of day 2, the Imperium not only controlled Frosthaven Village, but also had a firm grasp on the orbital laser, which should have meant it was a major victory for the Imperium, the Chaos team did manage to sacrifice enough stuff to please all 4 of the Chaos gods. This triggered another narrative wildcard event. As the cultists marched onto the shrine and cut their own throats, pouring their lifeblood onto it, as machines were driven onto the shrine, becoming disassembled by the warp energy and their machine spirits being offered up to the Chaos gods, the shrine began to pulsate ever more with an unholy energy, and 4 coloured orbs appeared and floated up, joined together. A red one, a blue one, a green one, and a purple one. And just as they all touched, there was a thunderclap that deafened everyone across the battle grid, Imperium and Chaos alike, knocking all survivors down onto their knees. And all of the remaining Chaos forces were suddenly sucked into a warp portal, their life energy sustaining it, keeping it open. From this warp portal, a beam of the darkest energy, so dark that you couldn't look upon it, it hurt. So dark that as it shot into the heavens, it was dark against the night sky and the void blackness. Moment, silence. Then from the void and from the portal, there emerged the horrifying sound, laughing of dark gods and the screeching of inhumane creatures. So what did all of this mean for the event? Well, rather than the Imperium getting a major victory, instead they only achieved a minor victory, because sure, they had routed the Chaos forces from the Polar Fortress, and sure, they had now got the orbital laser in hand and they can have orbital dominance, but perhaps the Chaos goal had never been to take the laser. Perhaps it was merely a distraction whilst they completed their ritual. And so what I said was that the Imperial team has got the battlefield victory, but the Chaos team has got the narrative victory. And this warp portal that is now permanently open on the planet is going to form the basis of the narrative for the next big apocalypse event that we do. Both sides were really happy with the result from this table. The Imperial team obviously had their win, which they were happy with, and the Chaos team, although they lost the mission, they had a really, really cool sort of story-based victory, and that meant that they could hold their heads up high. And what is cooler than doing something that is going to have a direct impact on the lore and the narrative for future big apocalypse games? So far, we've had a major victory for the Chaos team and a minor victory for the Imperium. It's going to come down to the remaining two tables, the Imperial defense of Hive Primus and the Chaos defense of the Manufactorum. Whereas the other boards that we've talked about, the Jungle and the Polar, had a very much a free-for-all feel to them. It was anyone's game. Both sides were attacking and trying to claim objectives around the map. These final two boards were very much attacker-defender. Hive Primus was the Imperial main headquarters on the planet, with the Governor's Palace being the primary objective. The Chaos team was trying to storm the Hive and capture the Governor's Palace. On the flip side, the Manufactorum was the heart of the rebellion, where the heresy had first began on Thanatos. And the inner sanctum of this board was where the Imperial team was trying to assault, attack, and cleanse. So both sides essentially had an attacker-defender situation that they needed to try and win. Let's start by looking at Hive Primus. This was one of the bigger boards. Whereas the jungle map and the polar map had been roughly 8 by 12 or 8 by 18, both of these bigger boards were 8 feet wide by 24 foot long, and it was a hammer and anvil deployment, so teams had a long way to go. But remember, there's no turn limit, there's just a time limit, so the quicker they can get through their turns, quicker that they can get up the board and start attacking. To stop either side from slow playing, I should have mentioned that there was an hour time limit per turn, so you couldn't just try and wait out your defenders by just sitting there holding the line and taking 6 hours to do your first turn. Now, of course, even with that, 24 feet is a long way to go. So on both maps, there were road networks once you broke into the first line of defense, and that doubled your movement. So anytime you were moving on the road, if you're infantry, you went 12 inches, you doubled your advanced moves. Same for the vehicles as well. So you could have Chimeras zooming like 24 inches and then also getting to advance if they roll a 6 going another 12 inches. So there was plenty of mechanics for being able to get up the board quickly. And of course, don't forget, both sides also have their blitzkrieg stratagem, which can help them double their movement again. So whilst it seems a long way, if the defenses collapse on either side, players could quickly break through and start heading for that primary objective, which in the case of Hive Primus was the Governor's Palace. Now, the victory conditions on Hive Primus was a bit different because you weren't fighting over points on a map. You were instead trying to defend what's essentially your base. So the Imperial team had 3 main areas they had to try and secure. There was the front line. That was the castle walls, the main curtain wall getting into the Hive. If that fell, they had to fall back and defend the inner missile silo. This was the main fortress at the heart of the city. And if they lost that, they'd have to fall back to the inner defense line, which surrounded the Governor's Palace. And if they lost that, and the enemy broke into the Governor's quarter and managed to get to the palace, well, that would essentially be a campaign lost. It wouldn't have mattered whether the Imperium had won on all 3 other tables. If they lose their Governor's Palace, it's campaign over. The Imperial Governor's lost, that's it. The coordinated defense of the planet will completely break down. But there's obviously levels of victory. So if the Chaos team takes the outer defense, then that's good, but it's still only the outer defense line, so that would have been a minor defeat for them. If they take the middle fortress, the missile silo, that's actually a minor victory for them. If they take the inner defense line around the Governor's quarter, but not the Governor's Palace itself, that's a major victory. And if they get the Governor, like I said, that's a campaign win. And you can flip that over, and it's the same sort of scenario over on the Manufactorum, where the Chaos side was defending. But we'll get to Manufactorum in detail later on. But now let's take a look at what happened in the game. The Imperial defenders were unbelievably hard pressed right from the get-go. I think that Imperial High Command in its planning sessions had vastly underestimated what they needed to defend the city. Chaos forces very quickly, through supreme artillery dominance, they cleared the outer walls. They cleared them very quickly, and a spearhead led by none other than Angron and the World Eaters smashed through one of the sandbag defenses. They cut down hundreds and hundreds of penal legionnaires, and day one for Chaos Team attacking Hive Primus was very, very productive. They took all 4 of the gates on the outer defense line, and they were pushing in hard, already threatening forward operating bases of the Imperium and just crushing all before them. Some highlights from that first day: the Praetorians and the Savlar Chemdogs got into a fierce rivalry about who could hold on the longest. The Savlar had the numbers on their side, just waves upon waves of cannon fodder. I think Angon alone killed 200 plus infantry that first day, and that doesn't even take into account the demon princes that were working alongside him. And then on the Praetorian side, they were holding off against the Necrons and the Knights, and they took horrendous casualties. Whole platoons of guardsmen wiped out, squadrons of sentinels. At one point, they tried to block the breach with 3 chimeras just abreast, and they got swept aside in a single shooting phase. Not even a mighty Hellhammer could do anything to slow the Chaos advance. They were relentless. They were unstoppable that first day. And a huge part of this was due to the Gene Stealer and Traitor Astartes forces that were on the Chaos side. Renegade Inquisitorial drop pods were raining down all over the city, drawing the defenders away from the front lines and forcing them to counter these fierce pockets that were appearing in their midst. And at one point, the Gene Stealers tried to infiltrate a whole big blob of 20 acolytes into the governor's quarter. Just by the skin of their teeth, even being forced to use a super stratagem or 2, the Imperium was able to lock down these pockets, either by containing them or purging and eradicating them. But all was not lost for the Imperial defenders. Early on in day 1, the Mordian 50th Armoured Regiment turned up and secured the governor's quarter. Essentially, I hadn't taken into account that the Gene Stealers could pop up 3 inches away, and I didn't want the game to be over day 1 with all of these acolytes just constantly just popping up and just getting into the governor's palace straight away. So what I said was, this is a bunch of reinforcements that I had planned to give the Imperium anyway, a little bit of a narrative event. But what I'll do is, I don't want to completely stymie the progress of the Chaos side, because they're doing a really, really good job. So I'll deploy my Mordian tanks, and they'll just go in the governor's quarter, and all they'll do is they'll lock that governor's quarter down. They're not going to participate, they're not going to fire any shots. They're just essentially a visual representation that there's a whole armoured regiment defending the governor's quarter now, and so you can't deep strike in there. For the Chaos team, I gave them something similar for their own base, and I said, look, the Imperials can't deep strike down in here anymore. They're going to have to fight their way up to it. So that just meant that both sides could actually concentrate on just fighting each other, and you could still do shenanigans in all the other areas. You just couldn't essentially deep strike into the enemy home base. This meant that the Imperial team was able to not worry so much about the governor's quarter, because they were getting a little overwhelmed, and instead they were able to focus on just defending their front line. And oh boy, did they defend it. Despite the fact that the Chaos were deep inside the city, the Imperial forces rallied on day 2. They reformed a new line. Reform the line! We take them head on! Reform the line! They reformed a defensive line upon what would become known as the Gelt Road. This was the point where the Imperium decided that the enemy would be stopped. They would come no further here. And they reformed all of their remaining available forces to make this an impenetrable bulwark. And amazingly, it worked. No matter how many times the World Eaters threw themselves against the Gelt Road, it held. No matter how many times the Necrons tried to implacably march through the Imperial defenses, they were thrown back. Bombing runs, artillery barrages, anything and everything the Chaos Force through into the Gelt line, and it did not falter. And the Imperial team was able to just hold. The lines were getting so thin by the end of the day, but they held that line. They would not bow. They would not break. And what was really fascinating for me to watch, because I was just observing this, is when the Chaos team had been assaulting the walls, it had been relatively open ground, so they'd been able to make progress quickly. And then when they got inside the city, all the different buildings acted as really effective bottlenecks, and this is what the Imperium took advantage of. Rather than trying to defend everywhere, they made sure they concentrated on the choke points, on the bottlenecks. They funneled the Chaos Forces into killing zones, and it paid off for them. And despite amazing progress on day 1 from the Chaos team, day 2, they were stopped dead in their tracks. The end result for the battle for Hive Primus was a minor Imperial victory. Chaos Forces had got into the city, and they'd made it a long way in, almost assaulting the halfway point. But the Imperial Guard managed to hold the line. And at the end of the day, despite the fact its battlements were covered in corpses as wave after wave of guardsmen were shoved onto the fortress only to be blown off by artillery turn after turn, the Imperial Guard did hold the main missile silo. They held the main fort, and so it was classed as a minor victory for the Imperium. The Chaos Forces were eventually stopped. And so we finally get to our last battle grid, the attack on the Manufactorum. Whilst all of this has been going on, the last stand in the jungle, the Chaos worship in the north, and the Imperial defense of the Hives, the forces of humanity have been launching a Hail Mary, a huge offensive onto the heart of the rebellion, where it all began. It is no exaggeration to say that this battle zone was by far the most intense. There was the most players, there were the most points. Dozens of Baneblades were fielded on both sides. One team stopped counting the number of Baneblades they lost after it went above 10, and that was on day 1. The fighting was furious, both sides not giving an inch and not expecting one either. Huge reserves and resources had been piled in from every team to try and make sure that they could achieve their objectives in this area. This truly was one giant push from the Imperial side. They had sapped resources from the jungle. They had allowed their defenses around Hive Primus to be tenuously thin. All of it so they could make sure that the attack was a success. If they failed in the Manufactorum, then they would fail on the planet. It literally was all decided on this one board. And from my perspective, that was amazing, because I didn't plan it in that way at all. It just evolved organically. On the surface, this attack seemed very similar to that on the Hive, but very quickly it became obvious that the Imperials had a much tougher time of it. Not only were they outnumbered by the Chaos Forces, but their defenses were more formidable. Hive Primus had 4 entrances through its curtain wall. The Manufactorum only had 2, and this made it so much harder for the attackers. No matter what the Imperials tried, their progress was so slow on the first day of attacking the Manufactorum. They had deployed the majority of their aggressive Astartes units here, and they should have been in their element, but the defense was so intense. Entire companies of Space Wolves, entire crusades of Black Templars, shield companies of Custodes were just mown down like wheat before the scythe. A huge factor in this difficulty was the Chaos style of defense. Whereas the Imperial team was happy to huddle behind its defenses and turtle up, Chaos team decided that the best form of defense was to attack. Even though the Imperials should have been storming the gates, the Chaos team sallied forth, and the Imperials found themselves wrong-footed very early on. They should have been attacking, but they often had to engage in defensive measures just to stop the tide of heretics that were pouring out against them. As a result, whereas the other boards were a constantly shifting back and forth, a sophisticated dance of death, the Manufactorum attack was a pure slugfest. It was a pure battle of attrition, and both sides could not afford to back down. But despite the Chaos team's sterling defense, despite their ingenious tactics, the Imperial advance ground on in the face of ever greater odds. Inch by inch, meter by bloody meter, they moved up the board. Counterattacks from Hellhounds, Leman Russes, Death Riders, even a dozen Flyers could do nothing but slow the Imperium. And bit by bit, they took the outer walls. It took them all day and horrendous casualties, but they secured the breaches. And by the end of day one, they had just managed to get inside the Manufactorum, and they had forced the Chaos players to fall back to the middle point. This was one of the mechanics that was active on the attacker-defender. If you take one line, your opponent has to fall back. The defenders need to fall back to another defense line. All their models that are currently on the front lines get picked up and pulled back to a new line. Once the Imperials had taken the outer defenses, it forced the heretics back, and it gave them some breathing room. On top of this, once they were inside the Manufactorum, it was a much more open environment. Unlike the Hive City, where it bogged down once you got inside because of the buildings, the Manufactorum was mostly pipes and barricades, things that could be traversed and easily moved around. The map, in fact, opened up. Again, it might have seemed on the surface like these two missions were going to be very similar, but they actually played out completely differently, and the terrain felt completely different for both sides. And so, despite a grueling day one, day two saw rapid gains for the Imperium on the Manufactorum. This was partly due to the more open nature, but I would say a huge factor was the amount of energy that the Chaos team had expended on that first day. Frankly, the defense lines looked very thin once you got inside the Manufactorum. There was a lot of infantry and a lot of chaff, but the Chaos side would have to respawn and bring up more armor, and that was going to take time, and the Imperium capitalized on this. In comparison to the Chaos forces on Hive Primus, the Imperial attackers not only matched their progress early on in the morning of day two, but then actually overtook them. And what the Chaos forces failed to achieve all day on day two on their own attacker mission, the Imperial forces succeeded, and they took the middle point of the map, forcing the Chaos back again. They took the Teleportarium. This was a really big blow to the Chaos defense because they'd lost a lot of ground quickly, and now, even though this is all happening simultaneously and the end result wouldn't become clear straight away, you could start to see which direction the boards were going in. You could see the jungle map was hopeless. You could see that the Hive Primus defense was stiffening. You could see that the Imperials were starting to gain ground in the polar region. And so the Chaos forces knew that if they didn't retake the Teleportarium, that could mean they lose the campaign overall, because the Imperium could potentially get 3 minor victories on 3 tables, and they would only have 1 major victory on the jungle board. And so, like they had done at the beginning of the defense, the Chaos team decided that they needed to counter-attack. They weren't going to win this by just passively defending their inner sanctum. They needed to reform and regain the momentum. I kid you not, this is no word of a lie. They stacked up Leman Russ's 3 ranks deep. At one point, there was a spearhead being formed of 4 Baneblade Super Heavies, ready to just drive forward and retake the Teleportarium. But with all of this effort going on, with all of these forces being drawn in from the back lines, from everything being put onto this huge attack, Chaos Team left some pretty big gaps in their backfield. Didn't cover all of their areas. And the watchful eye of the Imperium, ever vigilant, sensed an opportunity, and Operation Assassination was born. As the artillery shells crisscrossed the sky, as the tanks below engaged in body blows, a single inquisitorial Storm Eagle gunship snuck past the chaotic front lines, driving right into the heart of their inner sanctum. It delivered a kill team against the brain bug. You see, the Trader team had decided that they wanted to have a roving primary objective. They approached me at the beginning of the event and said, we've all talked to each other and we've realized that only one player out of all the Genestealer Cult players that are here has brought a Patriarch. And so rather than having the Inner Sanctum as our base, can we instead have the Patriarch, and he can rove around and he'll be a little bit more at risk, but we'll give him a big bodyguard of Genestealers, and maybe if we have him near the front lines, he can inspire the people. And I was like, you know what, that's a really cool idea. If literally 1 out of 22 Chaos players has only brought a Patriarch, it kind of makes sense that that would be your primary objective on the Manufactorum map. Now, at the beginning of the event, the Patriarch kind of lingered at the back and was fairly well protected with inside the Inner Sanctum. But as the situation deteriorated on the front lines, the Chaos team, or Traitor team, decided that all assets were needed on the front. Everyone, including their Patriarch. But due to the fact that they had not shot down the Space Marine Flyer, and due to the fact that many of their forces had been thinned out in the rear, it gave the opportunity for the Space Marines to fly in and actually go straight after the primary objective in a startling sudden strike. Leaping from their gunship, a squad of black-clad assault intercessors crashed onto the ground, led by an imposing Judicar. Their heavy bolt pistols blazing, they piled shot after shot into the Patriarch with supporting fire from the gunship. Many a Genestealer was scythed down, but the Patriarch itself managed to make it through the barrage unscathed. Unfortunately, due to their rather ad hoc and rugged descent, the Marines were wrong-footed and they were unable to charge the brain bug. Response: Heretic forces piled everything into the squad. Hellhound, flamers, autogun, lance gun, heavy bolter, round after round crashed into the kill team. But they stood firm. One by one they fell, but after the barrage had finished, there were still 2 assault intercessors and the Judicar standing upright. However, in a curious display of honor, uncharacteristic for Xenos abominations, rather than merely scuttling away, the Patriarch decided to summon its remaining Genestealers around it, and they would engage in close combat with the remaining Marines. This was the perfect opportunity, the moment the Space Marines had been waiting for. As the final 2 intercessors hold back the slavering mob of Genestealers just for a few seconds, they managed to buy enough time for their Judicar to engage in single combat with Patriarch. In a flurry of blows, too fast for the human eye to track, chitinous claw met Emperor Forged Blade. The Patriarch was a vile monstrosity, born from the stuff of nightmares. It towered over the Judicar, its slimy body exuding a sense of malice. It was a true alien abomination, the stuff that the Ministorum preachers warn children about. Its bulging cranial sac contained the knowledge of the stars themselves. But nothing, not even beings from beyond the galaxy, can withstand the Emperor's judgment. And, spotting an opening, the Judicar, with a single upward thrust of his sword, impaled the Patriarch on the end of his blade, cutting the head from the snake and throwing the rebellion instantly into disarray. The psychic backlash bringing all of the cultists across the world of Thanatos to their knees, reducing them to gibbering wrecks, their minds filled with terror and shock and awe. In short, the Judicar won the duel between the Patriarch. Basically, what happened was the Judicar and his squad dropped out of the Stormhawk. They did quite a good job at killing the Gene Stealers, but they were getting quite badly torn up by the enemy counterfire. And the Gene Stealer player charged in to try and finish them off. But he didn't realize that the Judicar could fight first. Now, this resulted in a little bit of a back and forth. Well, I can do this ability where I can pass my wounds off onto the Gene Stealers. And I just came over and went, look, this is an epic fight. We don't want one side to fight first and win, and that's anticlimactic. We don't want the Gene Stealer side to just pass all the wounds off onto the Gene Stealers, because that's not really cool. This is potentially a campaign-winning epic moment. It should be epic. So what we're going to do is we're going to have both sides just roll off simultaneously. So it's going to happen at exactly the same time. So even if the Patriarch kills the Judicar still gets to fight the Patriarch. And both players rolled side by side, and both sides got the same number of hits and the same number of wounds. And the Patriarch failed enough that would have killed it. And they used the CP reroll and they still failed. So the Patriarch died. And the Judicar just passed all of his 4+ or 5+ invulnerable saves. Didn't even take a scratch. His faith was his shield. And there you have it. The Imperials managed to pull off a major victory, a campaign victory on the Manufactorum attack. So the final results were one major victory in the jungles of Thanatos, a minor victory for the Imperium in the polar regions, but there's an active warp portal there now, which is definitely not good, and a minor victory. They just managed to hold the line in Hive Primus, and a major victory on the attack, with the final result being a decisive victory for Team Imperium. In terms of the narrative outcome, what this means is the Imperium was able to secure the urban centers, but unfortunately, they have essentially given the Tyranids an infinite source of biomass. I mentioned at the beginning that those trees grow back very quickly, and if there's one faction you don't want to give an infinite source of trees to, it is the Tyranids. So I've already done some follow-up lore on this, and essentially I've said that the Tyranids now have complete supremacy of the jungles that cover the majority of the planet, and digestion pools the size of small oceans have already begun to form. What this all means for the story is that whilst the doom of Thanatos has been temporarily postponed, the fate of the planet still very much hangs in the balance. And all of this helps us set up for the next event, which I am excited to announce. I had so much fun doing this one. I'd originally thought this might be a one-off, but thanks to all the lovely feedback that I've had and how much fun I had doing it, I can confirm that there will be another big apocalypse game. It's going to be called The Fate of Thanatos, and it's going to take place on the 1st and 2nd of June 2024, which is about 10 months away. So if you missed out this time and you want to get involved, then please consider buying a ticket. Your tickets can be bought via Element Games straight from their website, and at the time when this video goes out, those tickets should be available, and there should be a link down in the description below, and I'll try and pin one in the comment section too. There's going to be 75 tickets available, and the idea is that we can make the next one even bigger and better. More tables, more terrain, evolution of the story, and we can all come together and forge the narrative. Just a couple of final things to mention about the future event. I will make sure there's a Facebook page set up, link down description as with the tickets, and there and on the channel, you'll be able to follow updates as the event comes together and as more information and lore and stuff is published ahead of the big battle next year. But that's all for now. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. If you've got any ideas for biomes or maps, I'm open to everything. And of course, if you did enjoy this and you want to follow the updates, don't forget to subscribe to never miss an episode. Thank you for watching, and as always, I'll see you guys next time.